Our next speaker, who I will say again, is from the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, where he directs the curatorial staff and serves as the museum's curator of art. He oversees the weapons, sports, and cowboy and ranching artifact collections. So, presenting, shot in the Brisket, Western pulp covers as modern art. Please welcome Michael Grauer.
Thank you. I'm going to need water. This is the 20th anniversary of the first time I spoke at Prix West, so I'm honored to be here. My first lecture here was in '96, and I remember walking in here and seeing this giant room and all the tables set up, and I almost turned around and went back home. I didn't expect this many people. At that time, I was used to speaking to civic clubs and ladies' clubs where I'd haul my slide projector and my screen over my shoulder. And usually when I got to the door, they looked over my shoulder looking for the real art guy. They thought I was a roadie, just carrying the equipment, because I know I don't look much like an art guy. My full title at Panhandle Plains, I don't know about that curatorial affairs thing, because I always like to say if the curators want to have affairs, they're adults. They can do that if they want to, that's none of my business. But my full title is Curator of Art and Western Heritage, hence the photograph that you saw. I do a living history cowboy, and I work with all the ranching and historic American Indian stuff as well. So I have the greatest job in the world because it's like working in a giant toy store and they pay me American dollars to do it. Not very many, but they still pay me. But the payback to me is getting to come to places like the National Cowboy Museum and talk with you folks. And I'm so obliged that they have this big screen in the back with the timing on it. I hope they'll just throw a blanket over it, because if you attended any of my lectures, I tend to go on and on because I like to talk about what these things are about. But it was gratifying for me to be here last night and see the great works of art down the hall. Most of my work, in fact, almost exclusively, I work in the realm of deceased artists, and many people like to say I won't even look at an artist's work unless they're deceased. That's not entirely true. But it's mostly true because I've learned that contemporary artists or living artists, they tend to procrastinate, they tend to not be on time, and they're always trying to touch things up. Well, the deceased ones, they're never late. They're always on time. And so one of my areas of study, the lecture I gave in 1996 was on W. Herbert Dunton, who's one of the founders of the Taos Society of Artists. And Dunton's my guy, and I've been studying him for over a quarter of a century. And I'm fascinated, I've always been fascinated with his two lives. First as a Western illustrator, one of the most popular in the U.S., up until he throws it all away and moves to Taos, New Mexico in 1915. And then he becomes a real artist. And that whole thing, that separation between commercial art and quote-unquote fine art, has always sort of torqued me a little bit. I was a studio major at the University of Kansas, and when I realized one day when I was in art school, I realized, first of all, I'm not very artsy. I don't own a beret, and I don't own a cape, and I don't own any Chinese shoes with one toe, and everybody dressed in black back in those days, and I didn't have any black clothes. So I realized that I needed to go into art history, but I realized especially I'm not an artist. I have facility. I can draw as well as anybody in this room. But I don't have that thing that you real artists have, that when you wake up in the morning, you have that burning thing in your gut that says, if I don't create something wonderful today, I'm going to die. I don't have that, but what I do have is I want to learn. So I wanted to know why there was this separation between commercial art and quote-unquote fine art. And growing up and going to school and double majoring in painting and art history, I got to kind of see both sides of the fence, and what's come through to me is it's all artificial. I don't like to think of myself as a scholar. I'm just a glorified picture hanger who tells good stories, because the academics just make me a little nuts. And so my lecture today, my paper today, Shot in the Brisket, is really a poke in the eye to academia because of this nonsense about separating commercial art from quote-unquote fine art. To me, slop and paint is slop and paint. Pinching mud is pinching mud. It doesn't matter. It boils down to who's the patron. And if you go walk down the hall, y'all are the patron this time. Some of you may be willing to write the check, whereas for the commercial artist, he or she is simply trying to put beans on the table, using their God-given gift to communicate in some way. Just like these wonderful paintings by Wilson Hurley, they're trying to communicate something about the American West, right? They tell a story. Well, guess what? So do the modern people. And I want to include today, let's change the dialogue. That's my hope, is change the dialogue to be more inclusive. Now, when I say inclusive, it's important that you remember, for full disclosure, I'm the least politically correct person you will ever meet. As an historian, I have an obligation to tell you the truth, whether it stings you or not. I'm not responsible for your feelings. That doesn't mean I'm going to be insulting, but nevertheless, I have to deal in the facts and how I interpret them. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through some of these things here very quickly, and I will explain where the title comes from here very shortly. I'm a technophobe. I'd prefer if we did this by lantern slides. I'd be much more comfortable. So if I mess up on this, please bear with me. I think it's important to understand the context that somehow there's a gap or a gulf between what academics call modern art and Western art. And I think this slide, which appeared in the New Yorker magazine, this image, I've always loved this, and I try to shoehorn it in whenever I talk, because we are now in contemporary times, and this cowboy standing in front of this color-filled painting, he, of course, it's his first brush with modernism. And therefore, there's somehow this gap, this artificial gap that the academics have created, where Western art is strictly pejorative. It's not real art, because it did not fall in line with the Clement Greenbergs and the Harrell Rosenbergs, who set out to change the way we see art, especially in America. And so I like to start these talks, especially when I'm talking about modernism, to get you to thinking. I was in a round table in Taos, New Mexico last year, where we were talking about the founding of the Taos Art Colony, especially the founding of the Taos Society of Artists in 1915. And when it came time to the Q&A, you remember these, there were 6 founders: Dunton, Burninghouse, Blumenschein, Sharp, Cowes, and Phillips. Their descendants were there, and I was there representing Dunton. And we got to the Q&A, and the first question was, did they pal around with Georgia O'Keeffe? Now, please don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-O'Keeffe. But there's this belief amongst the academics that somehow when the Stieglitz circle takes over things in the U.S. in the 19-teens, apparently every other artist in America decided to become a plumber or an electrician. They just quit. I mean, why bother? Because the modernists are here. That's just a bunch of nonsense. It's just a bunch of nonsense. And the fruits of that are just down the hall and in this room and in this great museum. So let's keep that in mind, that that's a bunch of nonsense. And as I look through the galleries, I can see echoes of Mr. Dunton and Mr. Blumenschein and Mr. Cowes and Mr. Sharp and Miss O'Keeffe. And guess what? All of those people were illustrators at one time. Every one of them. And remember, Charlie Russell told us, I'm just an illustrator. I tell stories with my paintings and with my sculpture. And that's the important thing, I hope, is the main takeaway today. Now, the title. I would devour Louis L'Amour's when I was a kid. And in virtually every single one of those books, somebody gets shot in the brisket. And then they crawl into a cave and either survive and come out stronger, or they die. So I've always loved that, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to dedicate this talk to Anne Moran, because we were in discussions about putting together an exhibition on this idea. I hope it someday comes to fruition. And Anne, we went back and forth about what we should call it, and we both agreed that shot in the brisket is the way to go. So I hope maybe someday that'll come to fruition, but that's where it comes from. Somebody's always getting shot in the brisket, and you can use that figuratively or literally, however you want to think about it. By the 1960s, of course, commercial art was considered beneath contempt by the art world, and that comes from the Andy Warhol or the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation website. And I think there's no quote more telling, is that somehow it had become damned, and so the words mere illustrator have really condemned a lot of artists, not only in the way the critics see them, but actually in their own minds. And it started much, much earlier, because Buck Dunton, for example, writes a letter to his cowboy artist friend Harold Bugby in Clarendon, Texas, and says, you know, I always wanted to be an easel painter. We will have by this time next year at Panhandle Plains, we will have our own gallery devoted to Western illustration, inspired by this place, inspired by Anne Moran, our dear departed friend, who really was brave enough to do that. Most art museums won't do it. They won't do it. It terrifies me. Because remember, an art museum is all about pretending that you're not provincial, that you're sophisticated, and you always drink with your pinky in the air. I never did that. Yes, sir.
I was illustrator for artists in the 60s when what I was doing was art with a lowercase a.
There it is. Lowercase to A. Art. And then art. Hosannas and all. Right? Thank you, sir, for sharing that. And I applaud your work as an artist, regardless of who was paying your bill. Yes, ma'am. Frequently they did. Roy Lichtenstein certainly did. Now, sometimes it was just a reinterpretation, like I showed you the Wyeth and the Dunton thing. You can see they weren't identical, but it was actually a solution to the problem. How do I convey this? I'm going to use a slightly altered, but hopefully we'll see an exhibition that I'm working on called Parts. And it's about the influence of artists on another through their friendships. And it was so wonderful to see all the artists in the gallery last night, glad-handing each other and patting each other on the back, when ultimately you're competitors on some level, right? I love to see that. You're not art school artists, because they're vicious. They're just mean. Oh, come on. More questions, please. Yes, sir.
I think it's interesting because I really have a fine appreciation for artists like Bama and McCarthy, who are trained in that illustration method of just drawing something over and over and over again. At the same time, I have a lot of appreciation for someone like Billy Shank, who has very graphic, probably projected images, big color fields. I think we tend to look and judge art on the process and say, well, McCarthy and Bam are really good because they can freehand anything, turn it around and inside out. Whereas Shank, the process is quite a bit different, but very effective. What do you think about that process versus product?
I think it's good. It's an important part of the dialogue and needs to be included. But my question back to you is, when you think of Frank McCarthy and James Bama, do you think of them as easel painters or illustrators? Really? Interesting. And then Billy Shank? He's using graphic artist methodologies, is he not? It's a mélange. It's a mélange. All art is a mélange. Is it not? I think we need to get a little less hard and fast about this. Art is art. Slop and paint, pinching mud, ain't it? Right? Right? And it all tells a story. Even Jackson Pollock's work tells a story, folks. Really. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not down on the modernists. I just think there ought to be a little balance. No, I think there ought to be a lot of balance. Oh, come on. I want to argue with somebody. Yes. Social realist.
Wrote a lot about the inability to say nothing in art. He said when an artist puts a blank canvas on the wall, he's shouting, "I'm trying not to say anything."
That's interesting. That's what Clement Greenberg says was the great genius of the color field painters, because they boiled it down to just color. Well, I think they're just boring. No offense. Nothing more boring than our Larry Poons. Yuck. Sorry. I'm not a typical art historian, that's for sure. No other questions? Come on, more artists, throw something at me. I want to hear it. And I want to speak about this academic tradition thing, learning to draw over and over again. You know where that starts? It starts in France. When a person enrolled at the École des Beaux-Arts, and if they were American, they probably didn't get in. Because remember, you're American. And you don't have anything to offer but cowboys, right? They started out drawing from plaster casts, parts of bodies, not picking up a paintbrush till you were 7 years in. It's like a football play. Why do we practice? How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Billy Shank knows how to draw. He does. He does. He just chooses to make it part of what we don't see but we feel. That's the way I see his work. Use the tools at hand like silkscreen, wood engraving, whatever it was. You all are now adapting to, the artists that are here and in the Prix West down there, you've adapted to new types of materials. Looking at things in a different kind of way. It's all about reinterpretation. Right? Oh, come on. Okay, I guess I gotta stop talking. Thank you very much. I always wanted to be a fine artist, but you've got to give those outfits that are hiring you to do commercial art, you've got to give them what they want. Even he was believing that stuff. This is in the middle of the teens, so you can see that erosion of that honorable profession that it once was had already started, certainly by the teens. Andy Warhol also said that you should be able, now remember this is a giant of modernism now and pop and op art. He's saying already that there should be no distinction, and you should be able to do commercial art at one time and in the same afternoon paint an easel painting, and there's no difference. That's why I put this quotation up here, because I think it's important that you understand. Modern artists started to see in some respects how ridiculous this differentiation was. At one time in art history, illuminated manuscripts, and even today, were celebrated as some of the finest and highest art forms throughout the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. And we find rooms in museums today devoted exclusively to illuminated manuscripts, because these artists were incredibly gifted, mainly giving illustration to stories from the Bible or verses in the Bible. And initially, fundamentally, this is all about telling stories, is it not? However, in these museum galleries that are usually sort of darkened, and the lights come up when you walk in, and you hear Gregorian chants go off and stuff when you're looking at this stuff, this is commercial art, folks. This is illustration, is it not? It's the very same thing. So, as we go forward in time in the invention of the Western dime novel through the 1880s and so on, there were artists who were assigned to give illustration, literally help tell the stories better, on the covers of these dime novels. Usually they were artists who'd not been out to the West, for example. Most of the time they were in pen and ink and frequently redrawn onto wood blocks and printed as wood engravings, because they held up much better in mass producing these covers. And so that's the important thing to remember, is it was still an honorable profession. Thomas Moran participated in this, and we celebrate him today not as a commercial artist, but as a great landscape painter. But he never turned his back on his earlier career, because guess what? It helped him learn how to draw. And the basis of all art form is making the mark on the paper. Even if there's no paper and there's no tool, you're still making the mark, right? Even if it's in your own head. The great thing about Nikolai Feshin, in my opinion, is you don't see his academic training, you feel it, right? To feel the mark on the paper. You know the work's been done. And so these dime novels are illustrated on their covers, not inside because they're printed on really cheap pulp paper. This is where illustration continues. And then with the publication of Owen Wister's The Virginian in 1902, suddenly there's this huge stampede of Western fiction because they're meeting a demand. Everybody was hungry for stories of the American West. The U.S. government had participated in putting out government reports from the different surveys that went out looking for a special route or a suitable route for the Transcontinental Railroad, and artists participated in that. Lewis and Clark went out west, of course, in the early part of the 19th century. The sad part being is they didn't take an artist. The U.S. government never made that mistake again. They did not have cell phones with Lewis and Clark. So they were not Snapchatting pictures back to Washington and so on, right? So when Owen Wister publishes The Virginian, he's of course close friends with Frederick Remington. And to go along with the stories, how do we tell the stories visually? And so you start seeing the appearance of illustrations inside these Western novels by artists like W. Herbert Dunton and Keith of the Border, a book from about 1910. And usually these are easel paintings, usually 30 by 20, to fit on the page as the frontispiece. And frequently they're color in the front and then black and white illustrations throughout the book. But it was a way to tell the story better, the interpretation of the West. And frequently these publishers turned to artists who'd been out there. And we know Buck Dutton had been going out to the West since 1896. So by the time this is published, he's been out trying to be a cowboy, trying to be a hunter for 15 years. And so even artists like N.C. Wyeth, and I have to tell you this story. This is one of the reasons I put this slide up here. In 1996, when I spoke, I was on a panel with a gentleman whose name I don't remember, who spoke here on N.C. Wyeth following me. Now, one of the things I said about that separated Dunton from many of the Western illustrators of the time was he actually tried to be a cowboy. And he realized he wasn't any good at it. He said, I couldn't rope a dill pickle or a chicken with its legs hobbled. He said, I was a bad cowboy. So he actually started working as a contract meat hunter for ranches. But he figured out the wages were low. That romantic idea of riding the West as a cowboy all the live long day for $1 a day, he didn't like that. But he could tell the stories. Whereas, and I said this in my talk, N.C. Wyeth went out, and back up just a minute, Mr. Dunton did that from 1896 to 1911. So that's a pretty good long while, right? Well, N.C. Wyeth worked as a cowboy in Colorado for 9 days. And I really made the guy who followed me very angry. So I have to make amends to him wherever I can find him. I just got to remember his name. So N.C. Wyeth is one of the same guys who did, and actually the National Cowboy Museum owns the cover piece for Langford of the Three Bars. And I'm so proud of the National Cowboy Museum because it's one of the only museums I know of in the U.S. that has a gallery devoted to illustration. And I applaud you for that because that's so much a part of the American art story. So, and this is our painting at Panhandle Plains, called the Little Posse. And it too is a 30 by 20 used as the frontispiece. So it's kind of cool having both of these kind of together in some way. And you can see that these artists borrowed from each other when they're solving these problems. Much like copying old masters was a way to learn to be an artist, you learn from your fellow illustrators. And so Dunton and Wyeth and many of the other Western guys were learning from each other. So these color paintings, oil paintings, remember, laid out on a canvas, studied assiduously, they're trained academically. This is real art too, is it not? That's the question. And these advertisements were everywhere, and they were painted by human beings who were very talented and very gifted artists. From cream of wheat ads, as you can see here, to Arrow shirts. Every time you opened a magazine, there was an advertisement, not with a photograph of Kim Kardashian, but a painting done by a human being who spent much of his training and that particular gift on, oh, so what if it was cream of wheat? They still make interesting compositions, right? This is a very modern painting, and if you get the art historians to come out of their pigeonhole they put themselves in, they'll start to see it that way. And I saw very much of that down the hall. But my area of interest is really the Pulp magazine covers, the eventual evolution of these magazines. And the Pulp magazines were very popular during the 1930s, and artists were struggling to make a living during the Depression. Many of them produced pen and ink drawings to be reproduced on the inside on this pulp paper, hence the name. And I guess about 20 years ago, you may recall an exhibition here called The Pulps and the Slicks, a very important exhibition in the evolution of this study. But it was really a sign of distinction to gain a cover, to be able to paint an oil painting that would appear on the cover. And they were all about action and all about hooking you to reach up and pay a nickel or a dime for these pulp magazines. So it's all about telling you a story, making an impact on you, and punch you in the face to get you to pay attention. And that's what a great work of art, I think, should do, is grab you by the throat, punch you in the gut, or make your heart hurt. That's what I think is important about a great work of art. I get a little worked up, so I apologize if I sound like I'm yelling at you. I probably am. A little bit of an evangelist in me, I guess. Inside, frequently, in these Western novels were grisaille paintings in grays, okay? But they still had to learn the lessons of compositional layout that was truly powerful. And they often had to be very good at painting in foreshortening, you see, to make it a believable subject like this Gale Porter Hoskins that we own. That horse literally comes right out of the picture plane, does it not? And foreshortening is something we learn from Caravaggio. Is that not true? And we learned this from Leonardo. All the way back, it's the same lessons, folks. It's just a slightly different way to use it. And in this case, it's used to tell a story. And I love the title, Liars, as he galloped away. Liars. Grisailles also were used for historical reenactments, and in this case, this is a commission that Dunton received in 1910 upon the death, the untimely death of none other than Frederick Remington. When Remington died in 1909, he left unfinished for Cosmopolitan magazine. Now, this was a very different Cosmo in those days, folks. They used a different kind of hook than they used in massive cleavage and lots of sex appeal. How to Please Your Man and all that stuff, you know. So Cosmo was a respectable magazine at that time, and it serialized the autobiography of General Nelson Miles, which had been published in 1898 using Remington's pen and ink drawings. Some of you may have seen that publication. But they reissued it in 1911, but Remington had started the process, and they selected Buck Dunton as the only artist capable, because he'd been out there, of being able to illuminate these stories from Nelson Miles. And it's important that you remember, Nelson Miles never met a press agent he didn't like. Unlike Randall McKenzie, who didn't have anything to do with press agents. He was true Army, and he got the job done, and he took his men home. That's how it operated. So this Grisailles painting, and you can see the action in it. That buffalo is coming right out of the picture plane, yet again. And foreshortening, obviously, not only on the bison, but also on the horses. This is all great painting. This is all great drawing. It's just a different audience. And eventually these make their way, these same principles and concepts make their way onto the covers of pulp magazines like All Western, Ranch Romances, Ranch Stories, Western Stories. There's a bazillion of them. And for all bazillion of those magazine covers, there had to be an artist who knew his work, who knew her work, who knew how to do this to tell a story. So R. Farrington Elwell, Will Crawford, as you can see, and this is a painting we actually found just by accident at an auction in Arizona. You can see that the Will Crawford, who's largely responsible for bringing Charlie Russell to the world when he invites him to paint in his studio in New York City in 1904. Will Crawford is best known for his Western caricatures in pen and ink, but he was obviously also a very talented oil painter. And you can see the space that's left. Let's see if I can do this. All this space, of course, is left for the masthead and all the rest of the writing that would go on the cover. So we don't know exactly where this was published or if it was published, but still, this off-center composition, cutting off parts of, the horse isn't even there. All you see is the saddle and a little part of the mane. That's a daring and very modern thing to do, is it not? At least according to the modernists. And then let's go crazy here for just a second and think that the action in the painting, is it not using the same concepts and the same tools, the same formal elements that you see in great modern painting like Vasily Kandinsky? Look at that. I didn't make this up, but it's there. And I like to think that once my lecture is done, like an M.C. Escher drawing, once you see it, you can't not see it. I want you to be able to do that every time you see these things. I want you to look at Kandinsky and think, cowboy painting. That's my goal. And I know this is blasphemy, and I think a piece of the sky just fell. What about Pima Mondrian, one of the great modernists, right, in the early part of the century, certainly up until the first quarter? How does it compare to the use of primary colors on the cover of Quick Trigger Western, for example? I'm planting seeds with you, and I want you to remember this. And even on the cover, and using these primary colors, especially the large circle that you see here, is used over and over and over again on pulp Western covers. When the basic playbook for modern painting is reduction of the thing to its purest geometrical form. Squares, circles, rectangles, diamonds, triangles, and so on. This is what Clement Greenberg and Harrell Rosenberg were talking about. What makes it great in the post-war period is they'd gotten away from the pejorative stories and they boiled things down to their geometrical essence. Well, guess what? It was already going on. on the cover of pulp westerns, like you see in short stories. And this Clyde Squires painting is actually based on the Hopalong Cassidy characters. Mesquite Jenkins eventually becomes his buddy, and I can't pass up a good time to tell the story. Mesquite Jenkins actually thinks that Hopalong Cassidy is his enemy and shoots him. And then he shoots him back, and eventually they become buddies. As all good westerns should. You shouldn't be buddies with the guy that shot you. That's really important. So remember, he's boiling things down to their essential geometrical essence and using primary colors for the most part. But Clement Greenberg and Harrell Rosenberg are telling us that modern art has broken away from all that storytelling nonsense. Harrell Rosenberg, for example, said, the act of painting, of dripping paint or smearing paint on canvas, the canvas becomes the arena. And it's the act of painting that's important, not the painting itself. And so he becomes one of the great proponents of Jackson Pollock and what he called action painting. Clement Greenberg, on the other hand, saw Pollock as boiling things down to the formal elements. Well, guess what? When you take apart and pick apart one of these Pulp magazine covers, the artist is doing the very same thing. Now, I'm really proud of this, that I was able to do this being a technophobe. I actually did this by myself. Especially when you think about these formal elements, about the action that takes place on the covers of these westerns, used as a hook to draw you in to see this, to read the stories, right? Is that not what Pollock and is that not what Harrell Rosenberg was talking about? The very act of painting is not the same thing going on this Pulp magazine cover? Of course it is. It's painting is painting, slopping paint is slopping paint. Action is action, direction is direction. The artist is your interpreter between another place, another time, another subject, right? They are an intermediary. They're an evangelist. They are the pipe, not the source. You see? So, we go further, and Arthur Roy Mitchell, who of course is well celebrated, has his own museum in Trinidad, Colorado, and in case you go through Trinidad, I encourage you to stop off. It's in an old dry goods store, and it's really cool and funky. I like to go to out-of-the-way museums like that, but do stop in Trinidad. They've really done a nice job in cleaning things up. But look at this. This appeared on the cover of Street and Smith's Wild West. And you can see that action, and look at all the twisting and turning and all kinds of other great things that are going on. And you compare this to an action painter like Franz Kline, here in this slide with an assist by Steve Martin. And this is what Harrell Rosenberg was really espousing, was that act of painting. Well, guess what? So was Arthur Roy Mitchell. And especially if you look at images like this. Franz Kline on the left, A.R. Mitchell on the right. At its basic bones, it's about movement, is it not? It's about power, and it's about action. What directions are they going? Multiple directions at once. Because paintings and sculpture, fine art, are transportation devices, are they not? To that other place, that other time, that other subject, right? They provide us an avenue to another world. That's why it's so vital that we continue to support things like the Prix West and historic art exhibitions, so that we slow down. Slow down. Put this away. Now, this is a flip phone, by the way. I work in a museum, so I'm obliged to use prehistoric technology. Get your face out of this phone. Turn it off and sit down and look at one of those paintings. Don't breeze by it. Allow yourself, relax, and step in. And be an observer, and maybe even sometimes a participant. I love the previous lecture because did it not transport you to see Osages fighting Cheyennes and interpreted, and Mr. Pratt was the interpreter for us, right? He was telling us what that meant, and it makes you a part of the art. Art is a participatory event. The finest kind of action that can happen is that communion between you and the art object, correct? And believe it or not, it can take place with a Pulp magazine cover. Now, after the abstract expressionists sort of take over the world and we're told by the critics that this is really the only way to paint, because the rest of it is just kitsch and irrelevant, it's not true, it's not part of the advancement, it's not part of the evolution, The pop artists come along and they slap him in the face. And they say, that's a bunch of nonsense. Because much like looking at the old masters, much like looking at Rembrandt and Rubens and Leonardo and Caravaggio, they all inform what we do today. And I could walk through there, and I told you I saw the Tau Society people in the Prix de West exhibition, but I also saw Caravaggio. I saw Rembrandt. I saw Leonardo. It's all part of the great continuum that's art, including commercial art. And so artists like Roy Lichtenstein gets his start in looking at works by Paul Klee, for example. And what is he looking at? Is mythologies from the past. And the American West is very much part of the mythology of the American experience, is it not? And so Roy Lichtenstein's earliest work is a way to reinterpret those old myths. That's taken right from the mouth of Grant Wood in 1930. It's a way to repurpose old myths with a new kind of contemporary look. That's exactly what Grant Wood had been doing 30 years before Roy Lichtenstein is doing these things. What does he turn to? Cowboys. To reinterpret them a new way. He moves forward and he's doing Cubist work, but where does he look? The American West. This is his jumping off point. It's what he remembered as a kid. We all wanted to be a cowboy at one time or another. We all wanted to be an Indian at one time or another. So you return to your spiritual roots, the roots that you were as a child. That's your purest self. And this is what Roy Lichtenstein, I believe, was doing in his work. I highlighted these words here, and I think it's important that you see what the pop artists were all about, okay? And I like to think that they're part of the Western art continuum. The artifice of conventions and taste that permeated art and society, what others dismissed as trivial, fascinated him as classic and idealized. Classic and idealized. That's right out of the art history playbook that I learned in school. And where does he turn for classic and idealized? Comic strips and illustrations. Commercial art. One of his sort of opening salvos was Fastest Gun in 1963 when he goes on public display. But what does he use as his jumping off point? A comic book set in the space age, but still it's about Old West gunfights. And where does he go? On his great debut, Tate Gallery in London. That's a Western painting, is it not? Based on an American Western pulp, is it not? In a real art museum, is it not? And he continues through the early 60s with Foot in Hand, Fastest Gun, and so on. But where does he go to? He goes to the sources, like Billy the Kid comic books that started as their foundation in the dime magazines, dime Western novels that we talked about earlier from the 1880s, right? So 60 years later, they're still turning to those classic and idealized places for foundational support. And he takes that Gun in Hand directly from a piece out of the comic strip. He's being informed, and what greater tribute can you give to your art than to make it part of the art history continuum? And for artists like Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol and others of the pop art, they paid homage to what they considered great art. And that's comic strips and pulp magazines. Now, we know Roy Lichtenstein went on to use different things, not just Western scenes, and so he made this as his jumping off point, to pay reference to the past in art history at one time through the 18th and 19th centuries, to be able to look at a painting and say, aha, I see this is a reference to Agrippina bringing the ashes of Germanicus to Brundisium. Benjamin West painting, a great painting that he did in the 1700s. It was an intellectual exercise, so when you go down the hall and look at one of the Prix de West artists, and you can say, aha, I see Dunn, I see Kaus, I see ledger art. That's all part of the conversation. In the Andy Warhol Museum, they quote him a lot, and this is from their website. He loved popular culture, especially the consuming of popular culture, including Campbell's soup, where he eats it every day for 20 years. Now, I can do that. I love chicken noodle soup out of a can. That doesn't mean it's my favorite kind of chicken noodle soup, but I like that. I like to eat that way, okay? Andy Warhol did too, and it's being part of the American experience. And so he starts out painting the Campbell's soup can, and it's ridiculed initially. What are you doing painting something so crass and so base and so much about the mercantilism that's America? Well, guess what, folks? That's what's America. We make great stuff and we sell it to the world. Why do you think everybody wants to come here? When I was in Paris in 1988 doing research for my master's thesis, I'm walking down the street and I look over and here's Le Cowboy shop. I'm not making that up. Le Cowboy. And when Byron Preiss was here, didn't he not take some of your treasures and take it to France and Belgium? And the galleries were packed. Okay? So that's what we do, even down to Campbell's soup cans. Now, of course, all cowboys ate tomato soup. I'm making that up. Okay? So he made variations on the Campbell's soup cans, and he actually said at one point he thought he should just continue painting soup cans for the rest of his life because he was being true to himself, his own true spirit. And he enjoyed all the part of commercial illustration, which also included window displays. That was an art form back in the day, wasn't it? Some of you may remember that. I remember that as a kid. In the Philip Goodwin exhibition that you just had, there was part of a point-of-purchase cardboard display in that. That's where that comes from. And an artist like Philip Goodwin had to paint that, and then have it die-cut in cardboard and stood in a window. We lose some of that, I think, today, in the society we're in today that has to move at this speed. It's just kind of sad. So Andy Warhol is telling us a Campbell's soup can should make you stop in your tracks and look at it and think about it. Even if you don't like it, it made you stop and think, and that's the key. And so he did do them in multiples, different flavors, in small canvases that had to be installed together, and they are an exhibition designer and installer's nightmare to get them all level. Most people don't think about that behind-the-scenes stuff. Somebody's got to put the picture hook in the wall. Right? And make them look good. So bravo to the installation crew here on the Prix de West. It is beautifully installed. Wouldn't you agree? Wouldn't you agree? So he goes on and uses multiples because he talks about mass production as being part of his playbook. Producing things over and over, like 20 Jackies here in 1964. And then eventually he embraces Western illustration, and I always have loved this painting. Gary Cooper as the Texan, putting on lipstick. I love this painting. And just so you all know, when the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where I worked way back in the day, did an exhibition of Steven Spielberg and George Lucas's collection of Norman Rockwell, they did it begrudgingly because remember, that's illustration. And yeah, we'll do it. The lines were so long, they held it over for another month. Because we can communicate with this. Some of that stuff we just think, holy moly, I know I'm supposed to appreciate this, but I really just don't. But Norman Rockwell, yeah, we can connect with him. And Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, artists of the pop art movement, they fully embraced him. So you have paintings like this, like Herbert Morton Stoops, the painting on the right that was used in these illustrations well up into the 50s, well up into the 60s for Saturday Evening Post and so on. By the early 60s, you can see that he starts to turn to photo silkscreen process because that's part of how you make posters, and you can mass produce that way. So in many cases, when you see an Andy Warhol work, it's a silkscreen, but the art historians couldn't bear to allow that to be considered as the medium, so they invented a word called serigraph. It's a completely invented word to separate the silkscreen of posters with the fine art of the serigraph. You see? So Toulouse-Lautrec, okay, is over here. Alphonse Mucha, we admire their silkscreen posters from back in the day, but they're not silkscreens anymore. They're serigraphs. You see? Art historians, they're a bunch of liars sometimes. So, illustration has recently been acclaimed as the arena in which he first learned to manipulate popular taste. Artist as manipulator. art historians and critics as manipulators. And it says right here, his drawings are often comic, decorative, and whimsical. Oh my God, something fun in art? That means it's unserious, right? And therefore not to be taken seriously. It can't be substantive if it's funny. What a bunch of nonsense. It's just a bunch of nonsense. So he, of course, does his cowboys and Indians full suite. And this is the best image I could bring in. And of course, right in the installation down the hall, you may find a piece that reminds you exactly of this. Or 2, or 5, or 10, or 100. I don't know. But he saw the way to connect to the American public on a base level, on a true and honest level, heroes of the American West, and anti-heroes as well. He also painted action picture, which I just love. Action picture, 1987. This is not exactly what Harrell Rosenberg was talking about, was it? Because it, of course, is based on a Charles Schreibvogel painting. Reinterpreted, reinformed, part of the art historical continuum. Because quite frankly, and I don't mean to hurt any artist's feelings in here, all art is derivative. From the first lines at Lascaux Cave, the first carved female fertility goddesses, everything you do from there is derivative in some way and should pay homage to all of our history in some way or another. That's the way I feel. So, here's my concluding piece. At some point, there became this differentiation between illustration as not real art. Mere illustration is another animal altogether because it embraces the merchant, the dirty dollar somehow. Well, guess what? Last time I checked, an easel painter sells his work for dollars, right? So doesn't it not boil down to a question of patronage? Unfortunately, in this historian's view, it's the critics who have done a disservice to true art history, true comprehensive art history. And I hope someday we will have more than one curator in the whole United States of America that I know of that is a curator of illustration, and that's at the Delaware Art Museum. That's a darn shame. And it's also not true. It's not honest. So I hope I've piqued your interest. I hope I've made some of you angry. That's my goal. If you evangelize right, I hope that trip some of your triggers, push some of your buttons. Because if we don't have robust dialogue, we're sitting in the same stale rut. And I heard one time in a meeting that I go to, a rut is just a coffin with the ends kicked out. Thank you very much. And look at there, I got 4 minutes left, so I got time for a Q&A. Who wants to challenge me? I'll fight you. No questions? Come on. Oh, come on. For the magazines themselves, it's actually fairly robust, and these people have gotten more and more aggressive and more rabid about collecting them. And the art itself, the original oil paintings and drawings and stuff, they've lagged quite a bit behind, but they're picking up steam very quickly. You used to be able to pick them up for almost nothing, and now they're working up into low 4 figures. But it's important to remember that the publishing houses, whether that was Brown and Bigelow or Scribner's or whatever, they had warehouses full of these illustrations because once the artist turned it over, they usually didn't get it back. It was Frederick Remington who started copywriting his images, so he would actually get the painting back and then sometimes resell it. That's important to remember. But in some cases, they were because they were, I don't want to say mass-produced because that's not exactly accurate, they had so many of them sitting around. For example, when the Scribner's warehouse burned, we lost it. The things are gone. And so they often will come on the market as not being terribly well taken care of because they lean them against each other and do the registrar's nightmare of paintings stacked against paintings and all kinds of other things. But they are conservable. So they're out there. They are out there, and they're quite fascinating. We will have, by this time next year at Panhandle Plains, we will have our own gallery devoted to Western illustration, inspired by this place, inspired by Anne Moran, our dear departed friend, who really was brave enough to do that. Most art museums won't do it. They won't do it. It terrifies them. Because remember, an art museum is all about pretending that you're not provincial, that you're sophisticated, and you always drink with your pinky in the air. I never did that. Yes, sir.
I was illustrating for arts in the 60s when what I was doing was art with a lowercase a.
There it is. Lowercase to A. Art. And then art. Hosannas and all. Right? Thank you, sir, for sharing that. And I applaud your work as an artist, regardless of who was paying your bill. Yes, ma'am.
When they copied other artists' work, did they say after so-and-so, or did they have to or want to give credit to the other artist?
Frequently they did. Roy Lichtenstein certainly did. Now, sometimes it was just a reinterpretation, like I showed you the Wyeth and the Duncan thing. You can see they weren't identical, but it was actually a solution to the problem. How do I convey this? I'm going to use a slightly altered, but hopefully we'll see an exhibition that I'm working on called Parts. It's about the influence of artists on another through their friendships. And it was so wonderful to see all the artists in the gallery last night, glad-handing each other and patting each other on the back, when ultimately you're competitors on some level, right? I love to see that. You're not art school artists, because they're vicious. They're just mean. Oh, come on. More questions, please. Yes, sir.
I think what's interesting is I really have a fine appreciation for artists like Bama and McCarthy, who are trained in that illustration method of just drawing something over and over and over again. At the same time, I have a lot of appreciation for someone like Billy Shank, who has very graphic, probably projected images, big color fields. I think we tend to look and judge art on the process and say, well, McCarthy and Bam are really good because they can freehand anything, turn it around and inside out. Whereas Shank, the process is quite a bit different, but very effective. What do you think about that process versus product?
I think it's good. It's an important part of the dialogue and needs to be included. But my question back to you is, when you think of Frank McCarthy and James Bama, do you think of them as easel painters or illustrators? Really? Interesting. And then Billy Shank? He's using graphic artist methodologies, is he not? It's a mélange. It's a mélange. All art is a mélange. Is it not? I think we need to get a little less hard and fast about this. Art is art. Slopping paint, pinching mud, ain't it? Right? Right? And it all tells a story. Even Jackson Pollock's work tells a story, folks. Really. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not down on the modernists. I just think there ought to be a little balance. No, I think there ought to be a lot of balance. Oh, come on. I want to argue with somebody. Yes. Social realist.
You wrote a lot about the inability to say nothing with art. You said that when an artist puts a blank canvas on the wall, he's shouting, I'm trying not to say anything.
That's interesting. That's what Clement Greenberg says was the great genius of the color field painters. Because they boiled it down to just color. Well, I think they're just boring. No offense. Nothing more boring than our Larry Poons. Yuck. Sorry. I'm not a typical art historian, that's for sure. No other questions? Come on, more artists, throw something at me. I want to hear it. And I want to speak about this academic tradition thing, learning to draw over and over again. You know where that starts? It starts in France. When a person enrolled at the École des Beaux-Arts, and if they were American, they probably didn't get in. Because remember, you're American. And you don't really have anything to offer but cowboys, right? They started out drawing from plaster casts, parts of bodies, not picking up a paintbrush till you were 7 years in. It's like a football play. Why do we practice? How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Billy Shank knows how to draw. He does. He does. He just chooses to make it part of what we don't see but we feel. That's the way I see his work. Use the tools at hand like silkscreen, wood engraving, whatever it was. You all are now adapting to, the artists that are here and in the Prix West down there, you've adapted to new types of materials. Looking at things in a different kind of way. It's all about reinterpretation. Right? Oh, come on. Okay, I guess I gotta stop talking. Thank you very much.